Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA has a very active Facebook page. I post to the Facebook page regularly. So if you want to get to know ASA and the work they do, and more generally, if you just want to know what's going on with animal studies around the world, I suggest that you get over to the Facebook page and like ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now, this episode of Knowing Animals is also brought to you by MC Pony. MC Pony has her own website, Vegan Thoused, and also a Facebook page. Of course, MC Pony is a musician, she's a songwriter, she's a hip-hop artist, she's an animal advocate. So you can also find her stuff up on YouTube. And she tours, particularly around Australia. She performs at a lot of vegan and cruelty-free events. So if you want to see her in person, go over to her webpage and also her Facebook page and see where she's performing. Maybe you want to fly her overseas to perform somewhere international. That's MC Pony. Check out her work. Okay, people, let's get down to business. Now, this week I'm coming to you from Spain. I'm very, very fortunate to be a guest at the Rethinking Animalities conference that's hosted in Spain. Oscar Horta, who's a previous guest of the podcast, is one of the people organising the conferences. And now we're kind of sitting in the corridor in the philosophy department, and I've pulled aside one of the wonderful speakers from the conference, and she's going to tell us all about her work. So this week I'm joined by Michelle Westerlaken. Michelle is a PhD candidate in interaction game designs at Malmö University, Sweden. And we're going to discuss Michelle's article, Uncivilising the Future, Imagining Non-Speciesism, and that appeared in the journal Antae in 2017. Welcome to the show, Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So, Michelle, why did you write this piece?
So, I think what inspired me most is So I grew up in a small town in the Netherlands, and I was always surrounded by animals. Most of them were cats and dogs and rabbits, but also other like domesticated farm animals. And I think that being close to animals from a very young age made me get to know them as friends or like individuals rather than like objectifying them as things we can consume. And so I actually always saw it as very inevitable that I would focus my work on making other people see animals as individuals as well, like with their own life worlds, just like humans. And later in university, when I did media studies and I studied interaction design, I continued always to think about what can I do with this topic and how can I bring animals into this subject as well. So I continued to think about how different our relationship with animals could be if we actually treated them as equals. But then I was wondering during these studies, like what if we talk about non-speciesism, like what does that actually mean, and what can it actually look like? And then this question became the main inspiration for my PhD. And so, if we want to design a world that is non-speciesist, how can we even start to imagine such a world from our daily lives right now, in which animal oppression is so normalized by most people? And so, that's what inspired me to write this particular piece, quite like halfway in my PhD when I started to be able to talk about this a bit more.
Wonderful. Well, I was lucky enough to hear you present yesterday, and I assume that what you're presenting on is associated with what's in the article and the kinds of broader questions you're asking yourself about how we can rethink, redesign. But in order to bring the listeners into the picture, some of whom may not be familiar with all the expressions and concepts we've discussed so far, can you start by telling us what speciesism is?
Yeah, so speciesism, I think I would say it's generally referring to the oppression, exploitation, or abuse of non-human animals or of other species. So this is a term that was popularized by Peter Singer in his book, Australian scholar, right? Peter Singer in his book Animal Liberation, where he says that discrimination on the grounds of belonging to a certain species is wrong. And he actually puts this term in relation to other kinds of oppression, such as sexism or racism. And he says, well, similar to those kind of oppressions, we shouldn't oppress animals just because they're not humans.
But in the talk yesterday, you were problematizing the expression somewhat. So you're thinking about a non-species future, but you were saying that concept doesn't completely sit with what you're trying to do. Can you tell listeners a little bit about why the concept's a little bit problematic for you?
Right. I think in general, the concept is good to use in analysis, or if we are trying to fight against something. So if we want to demonstrate against this thing, then we can say, well, we don't want speciesism. But I'm doing a PhD in the field of interaction design, where I think that designers, similar to maybe artists, or writers, or other kind of speculative thinkers, or perhaps even like policymakers and people that are thinking about the future. So what could a future be like? And then if we talk about a term, non-speciesism, what we're actually saying is that the thing that we don't want, right? We want not speciesism. And for designers, I think that this is a really difficult concept to work with, because it will be similar to saying like, okay, let's design like a non-chair, for example. What is that actually going to be like? So I'm trying to find other ways around this. How can we name this thing, like this particular, maybe more caring or more compassionate relationship that we can have with animals? How can we name that, and how can we then start to design for something like that?
Wonderful. Well, perhaps you're going to add to the vocabulary that's available to animal studies scholars, and perhaps to all of us in this future you're imagining. Now, in the paper, intersectionality is also prominent and very important to you. Can you tell listeners what intersectionality is and why it matters to you?
Yeah, I will try. I think it's also one of those concepts that I think there's a lot of scholarship written about that. But the way I understood it is that intersectionality means that the different kinds of oppression that we can identify in the world right now are linked to each other, which means that if we think about something like sexism, we cannot disconnect that from something like racism. These things are connected, and I think that is very important in the agenda of, for example, animal rights people or people that are fighting against speciesism, to link this idea of oppression of animals to oppression of other marginalized groups of beings. I think that one of the books that I read about this that I found very inspirational is the Carol J. Adams book called The Sexual Politics of Meat. And here I think she makes a very convincing case that links sexism to speciesism, and saying how the objectification of women is very linked to the objectification of animals, such as seeing kind of women as objects as well. Just as we need to do with other animals in order to be able to, for example, eat them.
And in the article, you're also very keen to encourage multiple perspectives, multiple theories, multiple voices. Is that about intersectionality, or is there something else going on where you say we need to embrace a whole range of ways of thinking about the world?
I think what I was trying to do in this article particularly is to try and find a different way of gathering knowledge, and even talking about knowledge as something plural, right? I'm using this term knowledges. I think it's taken from Donna Haraway's paper on situated knowledges, where I think that it's very important to look at different perspectives and not to kind of look for one single truth about how we should live with animals, but thinking about all this multiple perspectives that we could take when we look at this question. And then in addition to that, I think also the more subjective kind of knowledges that we can gather. Like in the paper, I'm talking very much about feelings and how I felt when I learned about this objectification of animals and how I start to see the world differently through that whole journey of realizing what it is that we're actually doing in our world with other animals, and these kind of problems that you run into also when you start to change your daily way of consuming things and specifically consuming animals, of course, and then how you are so related to other people that have different ideas about it, and how do you actually work with that? And I think that this is a problem that, or a question that a lot of other vegans also run into. Like, how do you deal with other people that have different ideas? How can you still relate to them and spend time with them in a meaningful way without this becoming like a too big issue?
So emotions do play a role in what you're talking about in the utopian future you're imagining, but so does play, the concept of play. Can you tell us why the concept of play comes into your work and why it's important to you?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit coming also from my background, interaction design and game design, and I've always seen also in my personal life, like having animals around, that this idea of playing with other animals is actually quite a special moment where these species norms that we have in our society are maybe suddenly subverted or maybe go into the distance a little bit. I think many of us have the experience of playing with another animal, and I think that in order to play with another animal, you really have to get a little bit closer to them and try to understand a little bit more, like, how do they want to play with me? And the same goes the other way around. So this is a very interesting moment where the animal can also surprise us. And I think that this idea of surprise that is part of play, or the kind of unseriousness or less seriousness that can suddenly come into play, is a very interesting moment where we can figure out new kinds of relationships that we have. Like, perhaps normally a farm animal, we need to distance ourselves from a farm animal in order to be able to consume it, if that's what we want. But if we then actually start playing with that animal, maybe it becomes all of a sudden a lot harder actually afterwards to eat it, if that's what the line of reasoning that we're following. So I think play is actually very important, and I think next to play we have other kinds of moments like that. So play is not the only way in which we can get closer to animal. I think also ideas like sharing affection, for example, or meeting an animal suddenly, like all this idea of surprises or affect, things that do something to us emotionally. Those are the moments I think that we can perhaps design for as well, to look at what non-speciesist relationships can actually look like.
Wonderful. So, Michelle, listeners might be on the edge of their seat wondering if you know what a utopian non-speciesist future would look like. What do you conclude, or what do you find in the end of your paper?
Sadly, I wouldn't know what it would look like, and I think it's very hard. I think some authors have tried, though. Like I'm really inspired by some of the work by Ursula Le Guin, and the way that she can talk about how we live with animals in some of the utopian worlds that she's talking about. So that, I think that's a very inspiring resource. But other than that, I actually don't know. And I think that in order to get there, there's still like a lot of work to be done to figure things out. What I do know is that in the attempt to go towards this utopia, we need to collaborate with other animals, because I think that the animals actually maybe know better than us what a utopian society for them would look like. So I think we can just ask them and see what they tell us.
Wonderful. Well, Michelle, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yeah. So one of the more inspiring texts I read in the beginning of my research, like years ago, was by a philosopher called Thomas Nagel. And in 1974, he wrote an article called "What is it like to be a bat?" And in this article, he claimed that we can never fully understand the life world or the ontology of other animals because they perceive everything so different from humans. And in the beginning of my research, I thought that this was such a great insight. But actually now, 6 years later, I think it's complete nonsense. I think that we can actually understand the life worlds of other animals very well. I just think we need to pay more attention and actually listen to what they're actually trying to tell us all the time. I think that we have much more in common with other beings than the kind of legacy of this white male Western philosophy has been ready to admit, perhaps. And I think our shared way of being, or the very urge to want to live, for example, or our need for safety, they are very basic things that we share with animals. And I think it's not that we cannot understand them because of our differences. I think it's more that we cannot understand them fully in the same way that we don't even fully understand ourselves.
Interesting. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes. Actually, my mom recently, she found me this notebook, which I wrote my first essays in this when I was in primary school. And there was like one about penguins and another one about rats. And then one about this predatory bird called a buzzard. I had to look up the English word for this. But all of these essays contain some kind of message about how they should be treated better. And I have absolutely no idea why I chose these animals. But I still remember, the highlights of the book that I consulted for this project. So I think that would be the first kind of pro-animal scholarship that I wrote.
And quite a diverse range. You've got a kind of a animal that many people think of as a pest, a carnivorous predator animal, and a charismatic animal.
Exactly.
Nice spread. So if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Yes, actually, I mentioned her before. For me, the Carol J. Adams comes to mind, and her book, as I mentioned, The Sexual Politics of Meat. I think that here, the argument that she lays out is very convincing. And since I read this book, I really cannot unsee the many ways in which human and animal oppression follows the same structures, and it really helps me in arguing for the case of speciesism or non-speciesism.
Fabulous. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Yeah, this is a very, very difficult question, because I think that it's exactly this kind of interdisciplinarity of animal scholarship that makes for such a strong research field. I think also we see that here in this conference, that we have people from many different fields of research coming together, and they have all this one thing in common, which is that they want to make the lives of animals better, and they bring their own specialties to this discussion. And so perhaps the most important thing that academics can do for animals is precisely that, like collaborating with all of these different fields, and also always placing your own research within that bigger perspectives. Because I think that sometimes if you stay in your own field, you become a little bit blind to the larger frameworks that maybe you can situate your research in, and the other people in other fields that you can actually talk to. So I think that organizing these kind of conferences that bring people from different fields together to talk about speciesism or non-speciesism is very important.
Yes, it certainly pushes us, doesn't it?
Right.
And half the conference is in Spanish, which is pushing us even more, even further.
Yeah, but also there, I think the opportunity to bring people in and talk in their native languages as well, that is very important as well, even though for us it's a bit difficult to understand at times.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I would really like to have a kind of reset buttons for humans at this point, because I think that we somehow started out on the wrong foot together with other beings. And by now, I think that we know very well that animals are not machines, as maybe people used to think, and that they do feel things very similar to humans. But unfortunately, like the way we have normalized this oppression of animals, it seems almost impossible to get rid of it, because it's part of almost everything that people do. So in this way, like a reset button would be great, but perhaps alternatively, I would like for people to maybe open their eyes and their other senses and see other animals for what they really are. So kind of this removing this alienation from animals, so that we can actually get closer to them in different ways and figure out new ways of relating to each other.
Wonderful. Well, Michelle, what are you working on next?
So I have about 1.5 years left to finish my PhD. And right now I'm making a series of sketches the ones I presented yesterday as well, or perhaps we call them like design fictions in the field of design. These sketches are about like a variety of different kinds of interactions that we already have with animals in our everyday lives that could be considered as non-speciesist kinds of interactions. For example, like one story is about opening the window to let out a fly that got stuck. Like maybe all of us have had this experience that a fly got stuck behind the window, and perhaps instead of smashing it, we opening the window. So this is just like a very short, maybe story of a non-speciesist way of interacting with another animal. So I'm trying to gather many different kinds of these stories, like playing together with a cat, or a story about leaving like a pigeon mind her own business when you meet it in the city, rather than kind of chasing her off. And all of these examples, like I'm trying to sketch them out and collect them. And with this collection, then I'm trying to identify what non-speciesism actually mean. Like, what do we mean when we say non-speciesism? Or perhaps also, how should it be called instead of this non-speciesism, that negation? And I think that designers or other people that are trying to make things for the future need this kind of repertoire to draw inspiration from when they want to design something. And I think that designers, they are thinking about alternatives all the time, but their inspiration usually comes from the past or the present. So without having a kind of repertoire to draw inspiration from, I think it's very difficult for designers to design non-speciesist futures in this world that is so speciesist.
As a political scientist, often, among ourselves, we say that it's quite tricky studying animal issues because the discipline of politics has been very reluctant to think about non-human animals because, of course, politics traditionally is human power relations, etc. What about in the field of design? Do you find yourself terribly isolated as someone interested in animal issues?
When I started, I definitely feel that way. And design is also, interestingly, a discipline that is very industry focused. Like it's a field that is really embedded in capitalism. And also when we talk about intersectionality, like the idea of how animal oppression is so linked to capitalism is very very important thing to put together, because the way that we treat animals right now is often also to do with money, right? They're put lower on the agenda than humans and seen more as a resource. And I think that in design, it's similar than that. When we talk about users in design, for example, we talk about human users, and it's often already implied that these users are human. But I think that over the last years, there has been more and more interest in the field of for example, post-humanism or ecofeminism, or animal studies has also reached this part of the design research field. And so now I feel a lot less isolated. There are actually conferences that are talking about designing for non-humans, or there's a conference called Animal-Computer Interaction, which is about how animals use computers, for example, or use interactive technology as well. So it's growing, and I'm very happy about that.
I bet you are. Well, Michelle, how can people find out more about your work?
I have an academic website. It's just my name, so michellewesterlaken.com. And here I occasionally write about my research, and you can find other publications that I uploaded there, and also my design portfolio if you want to see some of the design projects that I have worked on. There's some projects with cats and dogs, and there's also a project with penguins, and also a project with a colony of black ants. So maybe you would like to check that out.
Wonderful. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals.
Thank you.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram. Finally, don't forget to leave a review. If you're enjoying this series, there's something you can do to support the podcast, and that is to leave a review at iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.